Namaste and greetings. I'm Mahima Kapoor, researcher and assistant editor at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली. Welcome you all to the IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a special lecture by Dhruva Jaishankar on India and the emerging competition in the Indo-Pacific. Under this series, The State of International Affairs, #Diplomacy Dialogue. This deliberation is being organized by the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies. I'm honored to introduce the speaker, Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar. Sir is the Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation, America. He is also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Australia. A regular contributor to the Indian and international media, he presently writes a monthly column for the Hindustan Times. His published research on India's relations with the United States, Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia, and Europe, defense and security policy, and globalization, democracy, and technology has appeared in several books, policy reports, and publications, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and Survival. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We are fortunate to have Mr. Graeme Dobell, Dr. Li Mingjiang, Mr. Jack Dish, and Dr. Felix Haydock as discussants for the session. Mr. Dobell is a journalist fellow at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Welcome, sir.
Greetings.
Greetings, sir. Thank you. Dr. Li is the Associate Professor and Provost Chair in International Relations, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dish is the Pentagon and National Security Correspondent, Foreign Policy Magazine. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Haydock is the Senior Associate at the Asia Developed Division at German Institute for International and Security Affairs. We welcome you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. The deliberation is being moderated by Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI. I invite Dr. Mehta to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahima, and good evening to everyone from India. Nice to see you, Mahima. I hope you're keeping well, and I hope all of you are well. So, yes, welcome. Of late, the Indo-Pacific has begun to occupy a strategic parlance in the geopolitics. Several countries have released and even implemented strategic decisions on the Indo-Pacific, and these include India, the United States, and Australia, Japan, etc. India, in fact, has established the Indo-Pacific desk in the Ministry of External Affairs with an express understanding that India is an inherent part of the Indo-Pacific. On the one hand, the recent declassified US strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific articulated the American goal of maintaining strategic primacy in the region. And on the other hand, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative seeks to reshape the regional and international order in accordance with its own interests. So where does India figure in the flux of the competition? An active participant, a spectator, or both? There are several bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral groupings of cooperation existing among the countries in the region. So can we see the Indo-Pacific narrative being used in a less militarized and a less geopoliticized manner? Is there a scope for comprehensive decoupling of the Sino-centric reorganization of the region? What does a future specter look like? To discuss these questions and beyond, the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies is privileged to be hosting this special lecture by Dhruva Jaishankar, along with eminent discussants from around the world, rather from the Indo-Pacific region. Graeme Dobell from Australia, Dr. Li Mingjiang joining from Singapore, Jack Desch from the United States, and Dr. Felix from Germany. I heartily welcome all of you, and also I welcome all the participants here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. Feel free to post your questions on the question and answers box. So let's get started. I invite Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar to begin his lecture. Over to you, Dhruva.
Thank you, Simi, and thank you to IMPRI for giving me this opportunity and for putting together what is a fabulous lineup of respondents from so many different countries. They're all people who I read regularly, and so it's a real pleasure to be sharing the virtual stage with all of them. In some ways, this is, the topic of the Indo-Pacific is sort of the topic du jour, topic of the day. The Indo-Pacific is a buzzword that has been on many people's lips, but still elicits a great deal of confusion and different interpretations as to what exactly it signifies. What I hope to share with you over the next 20 minutes is what some of my observations on the subject. And I will try to briefly touch upon four somewhat interrelated but different themes that hopefully try and link them together. The first, particularly given that some of the audience here are not people who work on international relations and security, is just to provide a backdrop of sort of the nature of geopolitical competition and how that's changing. The second is the Indo-Pacific itself and what, again, as I see it, what it signifies. The third is China's role. And the fourth involves, of course, the implications for India. First, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific in the very specific, we do talk about it generally in the very specific context of geopolitical competition. So this is a term that's been around in the biological sciences for many years, but when it's referred to now in certain circles, it really refers to a sort of geopolitical landscape. And this is a sort of a reality of today. International competition between the world's most powerful political entities, whether in war or in peacetime, was a constant for much of human history. But for a variety of reasons, and we can get into that in the Q&A a little bit, we had a period that was perhaps a bit of an aberration from roughly the early 1990s to about a decade ago, when many people, and these include political leaders, academic scholars, business people, genuinely believed that such competition could be set aside or made irrelevant or managed. But today we have a world that is increasingly defined by political fissures, and there are several that come to mind. The most important, I would argue, are the first being between the United States and its Asian treaty allies on the one hand and China on the other. A second between India on the one hand and Pakistan and China, so growing nexus between Pakistan and China on the other hand. Between some of the Gulf Arab states in the Middle East, led by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, along with an unlikely partner, Israel, against a sort of countries like Qatar, Turkey, and Iran that have a very different vision for the broader Middle East, and also between the United States and its NATO allies in Europe, and against Russia on the other hand. And these dynamics are playing out in a number of places. And just if you look at a newspaper today, in places like Belarus or Yemen or Afghanistan or the Taiwan Straits and elsewhere. So this is, I think, a sort of a new reality that we are all kind of coming to terms with, that a period where we thought would see less or manage geopolitical competition is suddenly now witnessing a number of flashpoints driven by the major powers of the day. The second sort of broad point I want to make is that the Indo-Pacific represents a reality today, in that the dynamics of the Indian and Pacific Oceans have merged and are becoming part of a whole. You see this in terms of security. So since 2008, for example, China has had an effective permanent military presence to the west of India and not just to the east. Eventually, almost a decade later, establishing a base in Djibouti. Japan has a military presence also in Djibouti. The US, France, Australia all have an active military presence in both the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And increasingly, even the Indian Navy is now making regular forays, at least once or twice a year, into the Pacific. A second sort of dynamic that you see is economic in nature, that the wider region is also reflective of these new economic realities. China's Belt and Road Initiative involves major projects in East Africa. Financing from the Middle East is significant in Southeast and East Asia. The economic dynamism between India and, on the one hand, and Japan and South Korea on the other hand, is increasingly evident. And there are perhaps reasons between the 1970s and the 1990s when a sort of narrower notion of Asia and the Asia-Pacific defined the region. So you consider membership of organizations such as APEC, which much more Pacific focused on East Asia and the Pacific Island states. But today, some of those definitions matter less and less. And again, the Indo-Pacific reflects these new security dynamics and the new economic realities of today. Many of these dynamics that I've described, both at the macro level and at the regional level, have to do with China. China is certainly not the sole driver of these changes. US wariness with its international obligations and political uncertainty, creaky old institutional architecture in the region, the growing capabilities of several Indo-Pacific economies, not least India, Indonesia, South Korea, Australia. They have a logic of their own and are adding to some of these, contributing to some of these changes. But none of these compare to the fact that China's rise over the past 3 decades has represented a massive geopolitical and geoeconomic sea change. It is today unquestionably the manufacturing superpower in the region. It is central to regional and global supply chains, but is also instigating a series of security, political, economic, and social challenges across the region for many other actors, including most of the other major powers in the region. I mean, I can briefly get into this, although there's quite a lot to cover in that area. For many years, we heard this mantra attributed to Deng Xiaoping of, hide your time, bide your strength, and hide your brightness. And this was seen as sort of a defining feature of China during its rise, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. But today, China is very actively engaged in security competition, often over territory and occasionally over resources with at least 9 of its neighbors, depending on, again, how you define such competition. And this extends to Japan in the East China Sea, with Taiwan over the possibility in terms of reunification, to the South China Sea, with a variety of claimant states, and of course, with India and Bhutan over territory in the Himalayas. In the South China Sea, China has dredged artificial islands, laid claim to surrounding waters and airspace, and militarized these entities in clear contravention of international law. It has engaged in intimidatory military standoffs with the Philippines and more recently Malaysia and Vietnam, effectively taking control a few years ago of Scarborough Shoal, one of the disputed reefs. With India, China undertook perhaps its biggest military mobilization in 4 decades last year. The resulting standoff, which is still continuing, was marked last year by the deaths of 20 Indian and at least 4 Chinese soldiers. These were the first Chinese combat casualties outside of UN peacekeeping roles since 1988. But it's not just the security competition that is defining the emerging competitive dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. In international relations, there's sort of a notion that interdependence, ideas, and institutions have a mitigating effect, will lead to greater competition. But all of these areas have now become domains of competition. Today, there's widespread recognition that China does not offer a level economic and commercial playing field with restricted market access in several sectors, heavy state subsidies, and predatory lending. Its governance structures have become less open, less liberal with the consolidation of power and the extension of a wide-ranging national security law to Hong Kong. And China has also been eroding multilateral institutions and norms, whether with respect to nuclear non-proliferation, cybersecurity, outer space, freedom of navigation, financing standards, and even the Arctic and Antarctic treaties. So I hope this briefly outlines the context and challenges that India faces in the Indo-Pacific, from the sort of larger competitive dynamics to the new interlinkages, to a lot of the challenges presented by the rise of China over the past few years. And so, when you're looking at this dynamic from an Indian perspective, I'm not sure it's often well appreciated even in India, let alone in much of the rest of the world, that there is an old legacy that India can draw upon of a more active role in a broader region. In 1947, just a few months before India attained independence, the interim Indian government actually convened a major conference of Asian nations in Delhi, with representatives as far away as Turkey and Iran, to China, Tibet, Australia, and New Zealand, and of course all across Southeast Asia, including the future leaders of places like Indonesia and Vietnam. After independence, India, and after World War II, India signed a separate peace treaty with Japan and facilitated its return to the international community, including, amongst other things, being the first recipient of yen-denominated loans. India played an active mediating role in the Korean War between the United States and China, and in repatriation efforts of POWs throughout the Korean War. It also played a very active role in the Indochina Wars of the 1950s. But a lot of these efforts came to naught with the India-China War of 1962. And the 3 decades that followed, roughly from the early 60s to the mid-1990s, saw a much more recessed India preoccupied with its immediate periphery and domestic concerns. In the 1990s, of course, with Indian economic liberalization, these started to change. And in fact, 4 strands of what I would argue today constitute much of the Act East policy emerge. And in some ways, I would argue that these are the defining characteristics of India's current engagement with the Indo-Pacific. The first, I think, involves securing the Indian Ocean, which for India will always take primacy over dynamics in the Pacific, naturally being closer to home. And this has included, in recent years, a big emphasis on maritime domain awareness, which is monitoring monitoring maritime traffic by air and by sea and undersea in the Indian Ocean region. So India set up, for example, a fusion center a few years ago to get information from multiple sources, and actually has liaisons with multiple countries. At least 9 countries have liaison partners permanently stationed in India to coordinate approaches to maritime domain awareness. This has been a major change over the past few years. Starting in late 2017, India's Navy also completely changed its operations and adjusted its capabilities to meet some of these new challenges. And these include active deployments in 7 defined zones in the Indian Ocean, where the Indian Navy now keeps a permanent presence either by air or by sea or undersea, and does year-round patrols. It's also led to infrastructure and capacity building, particularly in the small island states of the Indian Ocean, from Mauritius and Seychelles to Madagascar, and in the Indian Ocean littoral, from the Chabahar container port in Iran to Sittwe port in Myanmar. And these are efforts that have been, so strategic projects that have been supported by the Indian government. And finally, there's been on the Indian Ocean an attempt still underway, of course, to institute to create a sort of leadership role in institutions, including the Indian Ocean Rim Association, amongst others. A second sort of broad objective has involved, and I would say one with very mixed success at best, has been integration with Southeast Asia. And this includes institutional integration with ASEAN and other forums and ASEAN-led efforts. That has largely been accomplished. Increased military to military contacts with Myanmar, with Singapore, with Vietnam, with Indonesia increasingly. But one area I think that remains somewhat underwhelming has been commercial and connectivity integration. So while ASEAN and India are major trade partners of each other, they still don't, given their geographic proximity, still do not have a level of co-dependence that one might imagine. Again, the picture is much more mixed depending on which Southeast Asian state, but overall the picture is sort of, I think, has underwhelmed expectations. A third broad objective, and one that has seen significant movement in the last 2 years, has been establishing strategic relations with a series of balancing powers. This is led by the United States, but also Japan, Australia, the other members of the Quad. But it's not restricted only to the Quad, as well. France, UK, South Korea, and others, Russia in India's case, are all countries that India sees as essential to the balance of power in the broader Indo-Pacific. So you've seen a sort of growing series of military exercises now on a regular and sustained basis. Just to give one example, you had sort of Quad exercises with France recently, India did tri-service exercises with the UK in the Indian Ocean, as well as with a number of Southeast Asian countries. And this goes across all three services, the Army, Air Force, and Navy, on an increased tempo of such exercise and increased sophistication of such exercises. India has also signed a series of agreements that facilitate logistics, facilitate interchange and supplies between the Indian military and a number of these militaries. And we're also seeing a growing level of intelligence and strategic communication between these countries. The final aspect I would say involves, and certainly an important one, involves managing relations with China. India and China do have a significant and complicated relationship. This includes a major trading relationship, and of course, sort of very normal diplomatic and people-to-people ties. But this coexists very uncomfortably, increasingly uncomfortably, with major bilateral security competition, including at the disputed boundary, which has flared up over the last 2 years. Regional security differences, including over the Belt and Road Initiative, which India sees as violating its sovereignty by including through projects in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, but also having sort of negative normative effects in the broader Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific region. There have been disputes over bilateral trade and economics, and again, the level playing field, and also increasingly disputes on multilateral cooperation and institution building, following a decade or so of relative cooperation between India and China at the BRICS, at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other such institutions. My final point, what does the future hold? In addition to all of the steps that I outlined of sort of Indian engagement with the broader region, whether security or economic or otherwise, I would say there are a few sort of gaps that India will need to fill and think very seriously about. These include naval acquisitions and serious discussions about how much of the budget to allocate to capital spending in the Navy, how much that compares to other priorities, including in the on land and in air and in new domains such as cyber and space. A second sort of major preoccupation will require regional trade. India stepped out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, largely because of concerns about China's inclusion and questions about rules of origin and ability to enforce that. But in its absence from RCEP, India does have trade agreements with ASEAN, Japan, and South Korea. How best can it approach the regional trading order? There is talk, of course, of negotiations underway with Australia for an early harvest agreement by the end of this year and a possible trade agreement early next year. A third objective, I think, would be enhancing overseas project implementation. India has about $25 billion of stock of overseas lending, institutional lending. Many of it sort of micro, small-scale projects, but quite sometimes important ones. Including particularly in South Asia. Most of it is in other South Asian countries, but also in Africa and to a lesser extent Southeast Asia. But India is relatively new in this game, and of course more effective implementation of some of that, faster delivery and so forth is another thing India will have to focus on. A fourth objective, I'd say, would be boosting defense exports. India isn't a major player as a defense provider, which often leads to other countries, smaller countries, seeking alternatives in the market, the global defense marketplace. There have been some success stories recently, including in offshore patrol vessels and in coastal radar systems. And India is increasingly providing those to smaller countries in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, and possibly now in Southeast Asia as well, including Myanmar. But that's a domain where India punches well below its weight as a global defense supplier, and that will require significant changes to its domestic defense industry and its acquisitions process. Two other challenges have been somewhat complicated by the coronavirus pandemic. One is improved air connectivity, which still remains pretty modest, particularly between India and Southeast Asia. And we'll have to see how that evolves in a sort of post-COVID world. And finally, while India is in great need of investments, including from across the Indo-Pacific region, sort of greater attention to screening mechanisms that can balance the economic imperatives, but also keep in mind national security concerns is really the need of the hour. And we have seen some major significant improvements in that domain in the last year or two, so again, partly instigated by the boundary crisis with China. So as I see it, so this is the broad context. These are the sort of what India is currently doing. And what I tried to highlight at the end, I think, are areas that are deserving of much greater attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dhruva. It was wonderful and a brilliant account of India's positioning in the region, where the socio-economic, political dynamics, all this, the situation is really rapidly evolving, changing, and even sometimes shifting. So thank you very much for that fascinating lecture. I would now begin with the discussants' remarks, and I would like to invite Graeme Dobell. So if you could provide your perspectives on the Australian engagement, and how do you see things evolving and things moving, especially because Australia's relations with China has not been very smooth over the past few years. Over to you, Mr. Dobell.
I think the interesting phrase that we heard at the start was this idea of a new reality. And we really are looking at a whole set of new realities, not least even the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a construct. The Indo-Pacific is a new reality less than a decade old in Australian or Japanese thinking, and in the way India thinks about it. Another way of seeing that new reality is that if you go back, say, to the start of the century, 20 years ago, the way that Australia viewed its relationships with India and with China would probably be almost a mirror of where it is now. 20 years ago, Australia's diplomatic and strategic relationship with India was probably below zero. It was in a very frigid state after India had made its statement about itself as a nuclear power. Whereas through that first decade of the century, the boom in Australia's relationship with China and all of those elements of the relationship offered so much. So that now, when you look at where we are now, Australia's relationship with India is as close as it has ever been in terms of its diplomatic relationships, in terms of the way the naval discussion of the Indian Ocean works, and in terms of the sorts of cooperation you now see in the Quad. The Quad is very much part of this idea of a new reality, and the sorts of areas that the Quad is starting to think about working in is new reality on steroids. The other new reality that we've just seen, of course, is AUKUS. I think that's the way we're going to call it, Australia, UK, the United States. AUKUS is a really interesting bit of new architecture, new thinking, new balancing, but it has very deep roots. It's rooted very much in the old Anglosphere, in the Five Eyes intelligence club. So it's a remaking of a very deep relationship to, again, respond to the new realities in the region. And I think the other thing that I'd like to throw in is that this new reality, in some ways, there was a reference to Deng Xiaoping, and it reminded me of what Deng Xiaoping said to Rajiv Gandhi in 1988. Deng Xiaoping saying to Rajiv that this could be the Asian century. Although Deng did say that it could be, but it might not be certain that it would be. But in terms of where we are now, this idea of the Asian century, I think we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific the formation of a regional construct, a set of understandings about what the Indo-Pacific is, which is in a way is an attempt to capture the new central balance for 500 years. The central balance was very much about what Europe and the Atlantic made of it, Europe and the United States. And I think the really big news reality that we're dealing with is that the central balance in this century for much of the globe is going to be created in the Indo-Pacific. And in the discussions we've been seeing at the COP, the climate change discussions, one of the central points that we're hearing coming out of the climate discussions is that how hot the world will get before the climate is stabilized will depend largely on what happens in Asia. There's another part of the shifting central balance. So what we're really talking about in talking about the Indo-Pacific is what sort of central balance for how the balance of power is going to be worked through, and things like the Quad and AUKUS are classic examples of new balancing agencies being put in place. Very early in the game, much to do in the Asian century, but the Indo-Pacific, it strikes me, is the place where the new central balance is going to be worked through. Now, that's a huge change in the way that the large power structures of the world have worked for 500 years, and it's not surprising that we're having a lot of trouble working out how that's going to work, because I think we haven't got much structure to work with. But that, I think, is the really big idea of what the Indo-Pacific is going to be.
Thank you, Mr. Dobell. I would like to invite Dr. Li Mingjiang for his comments. And if you have questions, you could raise that to Dhruva. Dr. Li, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Mehta. I would like to just offer a few views from the Chinese perspective. In his presentation, Dr. Jaishankar mentioned that a lot of the dynamics regarding the Indo-Pacific have to do with China. I think that's pretty much also the understanding in China as well. A lot of things have happened in the Pacific, a lot of countries are involved, and understand it's targeted at China mainly. So the understanding from China is just the opposite direction. Many other countries argue this is to stop China from doing certain things. For instance, some of the security policies, East China Sea, South China Sea, which we heard in the presentation. But China believes that the Indo-Pacific has to do with China because the US wants to encircle China. And the US is mobilizing its allies and its strategic partners to encircle and contain China. And that's really the predominant view in China. Now, many of you may have noticed that Chinese leaders and their senior officials have very, very rarely used the terminology in the Pacific. They keep using Asia Pacific all the time. So that's a clear indication that the idea of Indo-Pacific or any talking about Indo-Pacific is not something that's liked in Beijing. And earlier, when the Indo-Pacific was emerging, I think many Chinese decision makers and their officials believed that this is just half empty and a half full cup. Right? It's not going to be real. It's not going to be threatening or very threatening to China. But I think more recently, decision makers in Beijing may have been surprised when they saw all the developments we heard from Dr. Jaishankar, also from Dobell a moment ago. You look at the development of Quad, AUKUS. You look at the naval activities of a number of countries in the South China Sea. I think they may have concluded that the Indo-Pacific is becoming substantive. So there's added concern, added anxiety, perhaps in the minds of Chinese decision makers. Well, despite the mainstream view in China, there has also been debate. We don't really often see this debate in the Chinese policy community, but from the very beginning, when Japan was pushing for the idea, when the US was taking the lead and a lot of things were happening, there were some officials in the Chinese foreign policy community who believed that instead of opposing the idea, China should actually, at least partially, join this strategy and be part of it. But somehow this policy idea was not accepted by the top leadership. Now, another comment from me is, when a lot of people talk about the role of Indo-Pacific to push back China, to oppose China's assertiveness, and you would be surprised to see people in China have very different views. They will not totally agree with this China assertiveness narrative. There was on some issues, China was basically doing things to protect its own national interests and valid, legitimate sort of thing. But some Chinese scholars themselves will also probably agree that some of the Chinese security policies or security behaviors, especially in the South China Sea, have been too heavy-handed, and then they understand these are some of the geopolitical consequences that are happening in the Indo-Pacific region. And they recognize that now the Indo-Pacific is going to be a big challenge for China. Now, I think many people in China also understand that the Indo-Pacific is now unstoppable. Many more things may come in the coming years or longer run, but they do have a number of policy tools or policy ideas. Number one, I think they have concluded that U.S. allies would be very difficult to tackle for China to cope with, but ASEAN countries could be a priority, could be an easier target for China's diplomatic persuasion, for China's strategic contestation with the United States. That's why we're seeing in recent years, China has really done a lot of things in Southeast Asia. And when ASEAN published its own outlook of the Indo-Pacific, China was not very worried, although it did not really offer explicit support for ASEAN's document, ASEAN's policy paper on Indo-Pacific. But quietly, Chinese officials say ASEAN positions, ASEAN statements were actually quite close to what China would expect and desire. But they didn't provide any sort of explicit open support to ASEAN because they did not want the Indo-Pacific to become officially accepted by ASEAN countries. They were still hoping that ASEAN countries would stay away from the whole notion of Indo-Pacific. And another major policy response, I'm sure all of us would agree, it's economic statecraft, right? China is hoping that its economic power, its economic initiatives would play a role in trying to persuade some regional countries not to be too supportive of Indo-Pacific. Right? Beijing is hoping that the BRI, right, and the upgrading of trade relations with ASEAN countries, now the RCEP, and perhaps next, we know that China has planned to join the CPTPP, and also intention to join the DEPA, the Digital Economic Partner Agreement. Through all this economic activism, China hopes that it could be able to use its economic power to try to cope with some of the geopolitical strategic challenges out of the Indo-Pacific. Let me stop here, but I'll be willing to add more details later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Li, for your fascinating response. I would like to invite Dr. Felix to share his perspectives. Dr. Felix, over to you.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yep, cool.
Yes.
Okay, great. So just a few points from me. I think a lot of them sort of latch on to what my predecessors have said. So first one is more of a comment in a way, but all mixed with a question, Dhruva. So in a way, I would take issue with how you at the outset portrayed the Indo-Pacific almost as a geographic neutral descriptive term. That is surely, as we just heard also from Dr. Li, not at all the case if you regard China's reaction and interpretation of the Indo-Pacific as a US-led containment initiative rather than as a confluence of the two seas, as former Japanese Prime Minister Abe has termed it. So it is essentially, whether you want it or not, but factually, it's not a geographic term, it's not a descriptive term, it's a geopolitical term. And many countries increasingly see it that way and see it as a balancing tool vis-a-vis China. On the other hand, and this again also connects to what Dr. Li just said, you have ASEAN, and you also have, to an extent, I would include the EU's conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific here, which are much more inclusive interpretations or conceptualizations of the term. So, however, various of those states you included as in the view of India as balancing powers, or you described or labeled them as balancing powers. How do the different conceptualizations of the term Indo-Pacific fit in with your basically idea of India connecting to quote unquote balancing powers increasingly in Southeast Asia, but also in Europe and other parts of the world? This would be my first kind of comment / question. The second one is on domestic politics, which you didn't talk much about. I would, however, raise the issue with regards to US leadership, especially in the Indo-Pacific. If we look at US domestic politics, at the moment, and I'm not a US expert at all, but still there's increasingly the debate on whether Trump in 2025 or a smarter Trump might come to power. How do you see basically future developments? How would you link those up to US domestic politics, especially a potential change in US leadership in 2025? And what would this mean for India's rebalancing or balancing strategies, where the US, if I got you correct, plays a sort of pivotal role? And the third one, I've got 4 points, so 2 more, please, if you allow me, is on the on what I perceive as a growing network, especially in the security realm, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, of minilaterals, of which many India is actually a partner. The Quad, obviously, but also Australia, France, India trilateral, India, Italy, Japan trilateral, none of which include China. In many ways, all this begets the question, especially with regards to the regional security architecture that's somewhat in the background of all of this. Is this a way to achieve security from China or with China? And if we still attempt to have the latter, at least as an option, how do we get there? I know this is a massive million-dollar question. Sorry for putting it out, but I would really love to hear you elaborate on this further. And then my last point, and you've actually said it yourself, the economic side of things is still rather underwhelming, not just actually with regards to India's Indo-Pacific policy, but even more so, one could say, with regards to the US Indo-Pacific policy as well. There is nothing very much coming with regards to the sphere of economics and trade from India, from the US and others. There's naval exercises, yes, there's arms deals. All of this is very well, but they don't put the lights on. They don't improve roads or ports. They don't put food on the table of ordinary people. How do you explain the dearth of activities, especially in the field of trade and commerce in the Indo-Pacific, by some of its leading proponents, such as India, the US, and others? vis-a-vis this increased securitization of the Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Felix. You have really raised very pertinent questions that require answers. And we really look forward to listening to what Dhruva has to say. But before that, I would like to invite Jack from the Foreign Policy magazine to share his perspectives and also perhaps throw some light on what Dr. Felix had to say about the US leadership in the Indo-Pacific. If you could also share your views on that. So Jack, over to you.
Yeah, first, I just wanted to unpack sort of some of the history in the US about sort of how Indo-Pacific became the term of art in US government. It was sort of Japanese initiative that brought it to the Trump administration and then promulgated it in 2017 off of a foreign leader engagement. But what we haven't seen in the US is sort of a lot of public buy-in and a lot of public understanding. So as Dhruva said earlier at the beginning of the conversation, there's still a lot of confusion about this term. And I think one of the key things to unpack what Felix was saying is just from a purely military and security standpoint, is the Indo-Pacific terminology, and particularly the alliances that are being articulated by the Biden administration, going to matter when push comes to shove, particularly when you look at situations like a Taiwan scenario. Dhruva mentioned sort of the interest of countries like India of having a security interest in the Indian Ocean and having an interest in their own territories. Japan, of course, has a tradition of that too, and a lot of political will and legal weight tied up in their own self-defense, but not a tradition of being an expeditionary power. So there's a lot of questions in the US about, should push come to shove, what will happen? And is this architecture going to matter in terms of security? The other question that the Biden administration has been facing is just what the positive vision for this competition with China is going to look like. Biden, of course, has articulated sort of the systemic contours of the Chinese system competing around the world with the US, but we're dealing with an American public that's very skeptical of foreign engagement after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so the administration will sort of need to chart out a positive course for what this competition will look like, because we're talking about years and decades, not just a shorter term conflict under the radar or an economic competition. And then finally, China's system, of course, has changed considerably over time. It's going to continue to change. And there's just very poor understanding in the United States diplomatically of sort of what China's up to. Even the public documentation released by the Pentagon last week about China's military buildup, about their nuclear prowess, really left a lot of questions on the table about those engagements. So just not a lot of answers on the US side about arms control, about a real high-level exchange on China's military. So that's something that's going to be left to question. And then when you look at the Indo-Pacific versus sort of the more narrow military scenarios in the region, the Taiwans of the world, the US is facing a question of how to engage. Do you sort of chase China around the entire Belt and Road militarily and economically, or do you narrow your focus to something like a Taiwan scenario? Can the US effectively walk and chew gum when it comes to all of those scenarios, especially with more limited money in the pot, with progressives pushing on Biden on the Pentagon budget? So the US just needs to sort of unpack what this means publicly, get American buy-in and support in a time where the American public is much more skeptical of foreign engagement.
Right. Thank you, Jack. So I would like to invite Dhruva for his response to the questions and the comments that have been made by our discussants. Dhruva, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for those thoughtful comments. I always learn a lot from hearing different perspectives, and there were really a lot of food for thought there. I was just struck by a couple of, I think I was largely in agreement with everything Graeme Dobell said, but I was just struck by a couple of comments he made about the central balance shifting from a sort of transatlantic world to a trans-Pacific world. And there's an Australian academic, late Australian academic named Coral Bell, who coined a phrase called the post-Vasco da Gama era, which I always thought, which reflected European primacy over Asia since 1498. And I always, that sort of struck with me as we sort of, are we really entering into a post-Vasco da Gama era? But I thought that was his reference to the central balance shifting to the Indo-Pacific, kind of recall that. To address this sort of issue that both Dr. Li and Dr. Haiduk both raised, I think it's a running theme, is the Indo-Pacific a neutral descriptive term, or is it a somewhat loaded rhetorical term that has various connotations? And this might seem like a cop-out, but I would argue both. In fact, it is both a descriptive geographical term that reflects some of the new realities that I was describing, new economic and security realities that I described. And in that sense, China is the original Indo-Pacific country. It is the country, through the belt, while it may not use that term, the Belt and Road Initiative in some ways encompasses much of the Indo-Pacific, from Eastern and Southern Africa, trade networks going east to the Indian Ocean and from there on to China. And then, again, if you look at the security profile, I mean, who would have thought that the first, overseas military presence, a permanent military presence that China would have would be in Djibouti, and that the second one might very well be in Pakistan. So, in that sense, I do think it is worthwhile looking at it as a purely descriptive term. It has also politically, of course, become quite loaded, and different countries' adoption of the term Indo-Pacific is reflective of that. So, Japan and Australia in some ways led the way. In India, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh actually first mentioned it in a speech in Tokyo, at least in an official statement. But then it has really taken on under the Modi government and taken on a life of its own. In the US, as Jack mentioned, it was really the Trump administration that adopted it. The Obama administration used a slightly clunky term, which was Indo-Asia Pacific. At least that's what PACOM used to use. And then in a joint statement in 2015 with Obama and Modi in India, they used Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean region, which is again a very clunky term. But it was really in the summer of 2017 that it sort of started being integrated into US official parlance. And by the end of the year, in December of that year, there was a national security strategy released when the first geographical section was very clearly titled the Indo-Pacific. And so I think from then on, it has become embedded in US strategic vocabulary. Similarly, I think looking at what ASEAN did with the Indo-Pacific Outlook, whether they would issue one at all. Dr. Li spoke about sort of some of the internal balancing act that was attempted with that. But it was really largely a push by Indonesia. The Indonesian government took the lead on that, and which is perhaps natural given Indonesia is a sort of archipelagic country which has Indian Ocean and Pacific coasts. And similarly, the recent wave of documents issued by European governments, including the European Union, the Netherlands, Germany, UK, France, have all increasingly adopted the term. So it has taken on very much a political connotation. And has certain implications. And the fact that China and Russia don't use it is very revealing. In fact, last year, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov gave a speech which sort of condemned the idea of, in New Delhi, condemned the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a sort of a containment strategy by the United States. So I guess the answer to that is it can be both at the same time. On the economic policy issue that Dr. Haiduk raised, I would hesitate to equate trade agreements with trade. So if you look at trade volumes, if you look at investment volumes, particularly private sector investment, the US is a major player in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia. Europe is a major player. Japan has, of course, the state-backed ODA, which sort of is comparable to what China is doing. But again, if you look at if you add sort of Indian private sector as well, it's not insignificant. So I think that there's a sort of dangerous equation of equating trade agreements with trade. And the US and India are today less interested in those kinds of open free trade agreements because they're the net importers in the region. They're the big markets. They're not currently competitive in manufacturing and integrate into those supply chains. Again, who knows what it'll look like 10 years from now. So that's basically the big, reason for that hesitation in India and the US being involved in RCEP and TPP respectively. But I think that is sort of fed into a narrative that they're not playing a role. Who's putting bread on the table? It's actually US market. The US market is where everyone is exporting to. It is the Indian market, which is one of India is the third largest net importer in the world after the US and UK in terms of current account deficit. So these are the drivers of economic prosperity in the region. But again, this sort of somewhat narrow narrative has emerged that it's really only about manufacturing. Labor mobility is no longer factored into regional trade agreements in the way it could be. That services are not really factored in to the degree that they could be. So the comparative strengths that the US and India have are not really being factored in by the ASEAN countries, which sort of explains in some ways the reluctance of those countries. But again, I think it's a very sort of narrow ASEAN-centric focus to focus only on manufacturing, on exports, and on supply chains, and that alone does not explain the sort of economic dynamism in the region. Would it be good if trade agreements could be brokered that are mutually acceptable to all countries? I think obviously yes, and I think that should be explored. As I said, I think India is looking at those kinds of agreements right now with Australia. Perhaps will be the first, the UK, Europe, and hopefully some other countries in Asia down the line. And again, the US may relook at CPTPP in the future. On US leadership, and I would say the one area that I've observed that there is a great deal of bipartisan consensus in the United States, and this is in Congress, and this is across from the late Obama through the Trump to the Biden administration, has been the Indo-Pacific, has been the sort of broad outlook to China and its role in the world, and to partnering with other countries, including India, not just India, but Japan, Australia. I mean, I would say the relations with the Quad countries, India, Japan, Australia, are perhaps the few that largely survived, with the least ups and downs from the Obama to the Trump to the Biden administrations. If you look compared to Europe, for example, or compared to other major relationships. So I think that even if there is a change in administration, if Trump comes back or if another Republican comes back, I don't anticipate in this area there being major changes. Now, it will affect some of the related policies for sure. Trade policy may be affected one way or the other, for example. But a different emphasis on infrastructure, might change. We've seen a little bit. The Trump administration put a lot of more emphasis on that. We haven't seen so much in the first year of the Biden administration. So I think the micro policies will change, but the broad approach to the Indo-Pacific, I'm not sure we'll see such major deviations, barring something completely unforeseen. Finally, I would just touch upon, this leads me to something that Jack said, which is on question marks about U.S. Public buy-in. I guess these are interrelated issues. Public buy-in. Will countries like Japan and India come to assistance in certain scenarios, and how much to focus on the broader region versus specific scenarios such as Taiwan? I don't see those as particularly contradictory. Public opinion on China has hardened quite significantly. The Chicago Council poll, amongst many other pupils, show that quite convincingly. And again, that seems to be one area which cuts largely across party lines, unlike even Russia, for example. And I think in both cases, both the Trump and Biden administration have been driven by the sense of burden sharing. That is, the US cannot be everywhere at once. The US has limited resources to compete. And this will require working with partners who broadly share their worldview in this area, to work on where they have advantages. So working with India in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, working with Japan in the Western Pacific on certain scenarios. I don't think it's a realistic expectation this is very different from, say, a NATO alliance where all partners in the Indo-Pacific will necessarily be on the same page on all issues. I don't think it is realistic to expect that India will take a role in the Taiwan Straits crisis that Japan will. nor will it be, I think, expected that a role in the Western Indian Ocean that Japan will necessarily have the capability to play the same role that say the Indian Navy can. But I think that there's a certain realistic assessment, I think, that I see, I perceive at least in the halls of government in the US. And so I'm a bit more sanguine about that than I think Jack is. I think those are broadly the comments. One more. I think Professor Hajduk had a comment. Your third point. Could you repeat that, please?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you mean the $1 million question?
Yes, yes. Yeah. If you could just repeat that.
The one on the minilaterals, yes. None of which include China. So, yeah. What is your outlook on a regional, or how would you rate a regional security architecture that, on the one hand, all leaders say we want no Cold War, but on the other hand, is excluding basically in many ways the elephant in the room, to the extent that many now fear that we've already passed the point of the new Cold War and that it's already there, at least in the security realm, which rounds counter to an extent, you could say, to some of the interests of littoral states, such as many of the ASEAN countries who fear they lose their strategic autonomy, at least to an extent, if they're essentially forced to choose sides. Right. Same, actually, you could say for most European states as well. Thank you.
Again, I call me skeptical on this. I think that's a very self-serving narrative on the part of certain ASEAN countries, because many of them have been asked to choose sides, oftentimes against their own side, including in the South China Sea. I think is the most notable example of that. And again, many of them are part of minilateral entities on their own. The Five Powers Defense Arrangement, to name one. Some ASEAN countries are part of CPTPP, some are not. There are a whole host of regional organizations. BIMSTEC, which is a relatively anodyne organization involving Thailand and Myanmar, but not the other countries. So for some reason, it's a very selective criticism of minilateralism that emerges. For some reason, some of these groups violate ASEAN unity and centrality. Some of these other groups do not, and I think there are reasons why that is. The other thing is, I think it overlooks the fact that China has actually instigated a lot of this, right? And China has forced countries to choose sides, and I think I won't go into too much detail, but Laos and Cambodia are in some cases in point. But on the question of the minilaterals, broadly speaking, I mean, I don't see an inherent contradiction there. Again, where they won't, for a variety of reasons, I don't think the countries will enter into mutual defense treaty type of agreements as we saw in the Cold War. I don't think it's politically palatable. Nobody in the US is willing to extend a security guarantee to India or vice versa. And so that is off the table. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, a lot can be done short of that. And I think that's what some of the minilateral groupings, including the Quad, are exploring. What does the defense partnership look like short of a mutual defense treaty? So a lot of that is happening at the bilateral level. Japan, and to give one example, Japan and Australia are negotiating a reciprocal access agreement. It should be finalized and needs to be ratified, but which will allow troops to be stationed in each other's countries. But a lot of other efforts are being explored sort of on a trilateral or quadrilateral basis. To give two examples, the US, Japan, and Australia are working together on infrastructure financing, particularly in South Pacific island countries where they all have relative interests and strengths. A different example, France, Australia, prior to AUKUS, France, Australia, and India were working together on maritime domain awareness in the Indian Ocean, where all three of them have a significant presence. So I think you have these issue-specific coalitions emerging that doesn't, where the interests and capabilities align. But that doesn't, to give another example of a trilateral that involves an ASEAN country, India, Australia, and Indonesia have a trilateral that has now met at least 4 or 5 times prior to COVID. So, I don't necessarily see those as contradictory, and I think the ASEAN countries will have to, each of them individually will have to think about sort of, my fear is that the era of not making choices has passed, and I think you alluded to this. there will be choices that will have to be made. And what those choices are, I think, will be quite determinative in the years ahead.
Thank you so much, Dhruva, for taking the questions and responding to all those remarks, and that is much appreciated. So I'd like to give you some rest, and I would want to ask a few questions to our discussants. Graeme Dobell, my question to you is, as I had mentioned in the beginning, that Australia's relations with China has not been very smooth, especially about, on taking the lead on the investigations on the origins of COVID-19. And right before the in-person Quad meeting this year, the AUKUS was announced. Do you see some kind of an intensified competition in the region because of AUKUS, especially in the southern Pacific? And also because Dhruva was alluding to the fact about ASEAN countries, they seem to be very apprehensive of any kind of a great power competition in the region, because they are so central to the whole Indo-Pacific construct. So do you think that this would lead to a weakening of the US-led narrative in the region? Over to you.
I think Dhruva's line about choosing is a good place to start this discussion. I think the point about where Australia and China have got to over the last 5 years is that Australia has made some choices. It's drawn some lines on a whole range of issues. And the Chinese embassy in Canberra did us all a huge favour by putting out a list of the 14 grievances that China had against Australia. The 14 grievances are wonderful, because if Australia was actually going to solve all 14 grievances, we would just about hand over the keys to the castle. To settle all of the things that China says Australia has been doing wrong would mean essentially giving up a whole range of the things that make Australia Australia, from domestic political settings to our regional settings. Now, the interesting thing about that is you look at, say, the experience of a Southeast Asian country that's gone a completely different way over the last 4 or 5 years. Australia has been drawing lines, choosing, and getting a fair few kicks back because of that. You compare that, say, to what the Philippines has been doing under Duterte. Duterte has really, in terms of that effort to go with China, to open up to China, putting aside the judgment from The Hague and threatening to walk away from the US alliance, got very little back from China in terms of investment, in terms of the sorts of pressure that the Chinese fishing boats are putting on Philippines, all of those sorts of pressures. I suppose that the point that I'm trying to make is that in terms of the issue of choosing, part of it is a matter of saying, at what level would China be satisfied? At what level would China be happy with what it's getting? And I think that's part of what the discussion of the Indo-Pacific has been about. That if we come back to some of those standard discussions of how you make judgments in international relations about what a power is doing in terms of its capabilities, its actions, and its intentions, China's capabilities obviously have been moving massively. And when you look then at what some of China's actions are and some of the judgments you might be making about their intentions, some very big question marks arise. And so the reason we now have Quad Mark II after Quad Mark I fell over is that Quad Mark I fell over because Australia and to a lesser extent, China and India and Japan were not yet able to work out how far they wanted to go. The real reason, I think, in many ways, that we now have Quad Mark II, a much stronger, a much bigger operation, is it's a response to China. China is the parent of Quad Mark II, and part of what Quad Mark II is a bunch of countries in the region making choices about where their lines are going to be and what they are going to do in terms of the central balance.
Thank you, sir. My question to Dr. Li is from the audience by K. Adam, who asks, please talk about the Taiwan situation. Will this further challenge, will this lead to a further challenge with the US coming to assistance of Taiwan in case of an attack by China? Your views?
Well, thanks, K. Adam, for raising this question. Well, very briefly, number one, I would say that a lot of things we're seeing in the Taiwan Straits are manifestations of action-reaction. There is obviously a vicious cycle that's going on between mainland China, Taiwan, between China and the United States. If you look at all the specific like events and the movements, you will see it's really a pattern of action-reaction. It's for mainland China, for Beijing, there's a lot of worry about political leadership in Taiwan doing certain things to create conditions that would be conducive for independence. And in the Chinese understanding, the US has very significantly changed its Taiwan policy. And some of the American policies or interaction with Taiwan, in the eyes of Chinese leaders, may have come very close to what China defines as red lines, or even may have crossed some of the red lines. And some of the more hawkish policy elites in Beijing may believe that now the U.S. has an unspoken agenda of supporting gradual independence of Taiwan. So that's why. And second point I want to make, all these military, all the security tensions we're seeing in the Taiwan Strait, in my view, is largely deterrence. I think the logic for mainland China is that, you put up all these strong, tough responses and send a signal to Washington that don't play fire. If you play fire, it's going to be very dangerous. I don't think this is, preparation for war or military campaign yet at this moment. And last point I want to make is it's never going to be an easy decision for Beijing to make the decision to use military option to resolve the Taiwan issue and achieve unifications. It will never be an easy decision. I mean, they have to take into account many big questions, a lot of considerations. And personally, certainly nobody would rule out military contingency, but before this final resort of a military approach, I think Beijing may have many policy tools. For instance, I'm sure some of you have noticed in the past few days, there was an announcement that mainland China will impose sort of like sanctions on some of the pro-independence leaders in Taiwan. So what you're seeing is sort of the fact that China may actually have some non-military options, legal approach, for instance. And even if we talk about military approach, there could be quite a number of scenarios. For instance, it could use military coercion and to compel Taiwan to come to the negotiation table and talk about some sort of like political settlements of the issue. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. So I'd like to ask this question to Dr. Felix about the recent EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific that was unveiled. At a deeper level, does it portray a growing realization of China's muscle flexing through the BRI, and also that several European countries who were erstwhile colonial powers feel a bit discomforted by a similar approach that is being adopted by an Oriental country? Dr.
Yeah,
Felix.
thank you very much for these questions. Well, I'll start with the colonial power one first. I wouldn't say that's rooted in Europe's, in brackets, colonial history so much as in, I think, a rapidly changing image of China in Europe. Amongst the population, maybe to a lesser extent, but definitely amongst policymakers, there's definitely basically, I would say, an increasing realism what our quote-unquote relations with China actually look like if you compare it to the dominant China image that was basically in place until like 3-4 years ago, which was basically, oh, there's this massive export market. That was definitely the dominant image in Germany that we need to tap into, and it's all basically opportunities and promises and so on and so forth. And now, if you look at the China white paper as well, you know, it's partner, it's competitor, and it's systemic rival. So it's much more multidimensional, and it's much more, I would say, realistic as well. So I'd say this is actually it. Again, of course, you cannot separate the changes in the image, of course, to an extent from China's behavior in the region. We've already discussed this, South China Sea, increasing assertiveness, and so on and so forth, BRI, but also vis-a-vis the European Union and its member states. So there is definitely that. And then the second part of your question was on the growing realization, and that's increasingly tied with regards to BRI. I would say it's not really a realization. I wouldn't say it's like, basically there's such a dominant threat perception, I would call it, as you have say in the United States, for example, or in some other countries in the region with regards to China. But it's definitely, I would say, if we look at the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU, it's definitely a much more nuanced approach. I think the main question from my point of view, and I'll leave it at that, is whether the European Union actually has the political will and the capabilities and capacities to increasingly play this stronger role that it seeks to play according to the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific. Because when I look at European foreign policy and foreign policies of EU member states, I think there's a certain disconnect, at least to an extent, between an increasingly securitized Indo-Pacific and what Europe or European member states can actually bring to the table, which is, if we want to talk about security, I see it more in the realm of non-traditional security, and even more so in the term of commerce, in the sphere of commerce and trade. Whereas the expectation, I think, from also partners in the region is increasingly also to play a hard, so to say, traditional security role, which I don't see as very much realistic at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Felix. So I would like to ask this question to Jack. This question came up over the email for you about the recent visit by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. It was purported by several media outlets that his visit was actually to reassure these countries, that reassure them as they are concerned by China's growing military abilities. My question is, was it to reassure the US that it has their back in the Indo-Pacific narrative? And what are the emerging dynamics in the Indo-Pacific look like in the Pentagon conversations? Your perspectives and your stories, if you would want to share.
Two things I would posit. One, the Biden administration got off on a tricky foot with the ASEAN grouping. There's no other way to say it. We had reported earlier this year that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State's first interaction with the ASEAN grouping had been derailed by technical difficulties when they tried to call. And that led to sort of a makeup visit, if you would, by the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman. So there's been kind of a large grouping of American officials. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's been twice. Now Vice President Harris has been out to the region as well to kind of reassure the ASEAN grouping sort of their ranking in the priority pecking order, especially since the Quad has kind of sort of surmounted it to some degree, at least in terms of the number of headlines it's gotten. The other thing I would posit too is in terms of Southeast Asia, the US, of course, wants to have more of a military footprint, as it seems like Duterte has now kind of begun to distance himself a little bit from China, and we see as we're in the twilight of his administration, a move potentially more towards the United States. The Pentagon sees an opportunity there for more rotational American troop presence and ability to send more troops through the region, along with what they're going to do with more troop laydowns in Australia that's going to come through AUKUS that could give them sort of more military relevance and military heft in the region in the short term. So it's a combination of those two things, trying to sort of sort through the alliance structure that we've talked about a lot this morning, and also trying to get the military footprint right when it comes to dealing with China.
Thank you, Jack. So wonderful round of discussions. And I would like to ask a few questions to Dhruva about the Northwest Indian Ocean, which you mentioned about in the beginning of your lecture. You know, there is the growing role of some of West Asian countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Turkey, Iran, etc., which is an important development in the evolving geopolitics of the Indian Ocean. So what are the security dynamics that emerge given the intense engagement with each of them vis-a-vis the US and China in the region? What could be the implications for India, because their own bilateral relations, would they be affected, or that would remain unaffected? What is your take on it?
Right. I know in some ways that broader region, what in India we call West Asia, and what you know others refer to as the Middle East, you know, is somewhat, the dynamic is somewhat different from the rest of the broader region that described, in the sense that you know, arguably China, and even though the US has a major military presence there, China and the US don't impose the same, you know, it's less of a bipolar system, and you have quite strong and influential autonomous actors there that have their own interests, you know, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, that have their own dynamics at play. So it's slightly more, I actually just returned from the UAE last week, so a lot of that on my mind, but it's, so I think, you know, it is a slightly different dynamic, and interests are also quite different as well. So you have, you know, for India at least, you have a large diaspora that's an interest. Energy dynamics are somewhat different, and then the security, the non-traditional security dynamics again are somewhat different. So I do think it's worth setting, worth recognizing that, and recognizing that again the drivers of competition will be somewhat distinct there. But that being said, obviously there is an overlap, and again the fact that the US retains a major security presence in the region, that China and Japan are not far off in Djibouti, that India patrols regularly in the Gulf of Aden, suggests that again there will be interesting interlinkages. It's interesting to note that the PLA Navy, I think there are only 5 ports in the Indian Ocean where the PLA Navy does replenishment. Dr. Li might be able to confirm some of this, but west of Singapore, and all of them are in the Middle East. It's Jeddah, Djibouti, Aden, Salalah, and Oman. And Karachi in Pakistan. So all of them are in that region, and so I think we will see a sort of a bleeding together of some of these dynamics. And one possible reflection of that, although it's very early days, is the recent other quad that met, US, India, UAE, Israel, that met for the first time. But again, we still have to see how that evolves. But I think for my final point on that is, I think there is a big difference of perception of how different countries see that integrating into the broader Indo-Pacific dynamic. I've spoken to US and UK officials who don't see assets in the Middle East playing a significant role in Indo-Pacific contingencies, even though the geography suggests that it could. To give an example, showing a map to a British official, and noted that Duqm, which is a port in Oman, where Britain has assets, is in the Indian Ocean, and he said, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it as an Indo-Pacific asset of ours. So I do think there's some conceptual gaps there. Whereas for India, I think the entirety of the Indian Ocean is central to its vision of an Indo-Pacific, and so there is a sort of greater facility of thinking about the broader Middle East as part of the Indo-Pacific dynamic.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you, Dhruva. I have a very small question. This is by Dipankar Dey from Central University of Jharkhand, who asks a pertinent question about the role of island territories, especially Andaman and Nicobar Islands. What are the major traditional and non-traditional security threats to these islands, given these islands are in the Indo-Pacific? So what do you have to say about it?
So the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are actually, geopolitically incredibly significant, in the sense that they are located just across the mouth of the Straits of Malacca, and therefore, are vital in that sense. The Indian Navy has a significant presence there. It has, in fact, it's the only joint Indian command is at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So it's in some ways a test case for joint warfare fighting for the Indian military as well. That being said, there has been some developments. A new naval base was inaugurated a couple of years ago in the North Andamans. But that being said, India's ability to exploit it has been limited by at least two factors, one of which is actually environmental considerations. And there are, in fact, sort of court rulings that India has to, including the Indian military, has to abide by about protecting some of the biodiversity of the region. And then the other element is actually vulnerable tribal populations as well. And that has complicated certain attempts at developing infrastructure, including power plants and rail projects there. So in theory, a lot of people have spoken about developing some of the Nicobar Islands as a container port hub. The geography certainly sort of suggests that is possible, right in the middle of the Bay of Bengal. But again, there have been these complications that have made it difficult for India to fully exploit those conditions. But it remains a major asset. The US, a US P-8 was reported just last year, or 2 years ago, as making its first stopover in the for refueling in Port Blair in the Andaman. So you can, I think we'll start seeing it being used more, and the Indian Navy does hold a sort of international multilateral exercises periodically off of there. Australia was invited to one not too long ago. So I think a space to watch, but I think there are some constraints to fully exploiting it from a geopolitical point of view.
Absolutely, that's right. So thank you so much, Dhruva. We have with us Professor K.P. Vijayalakshmi. She is a professor of American Studies at the Center for Canadian United States and Latin American Studies at JNU. So good evening, ma'am, and my teacher. So thank you, ma'am, for coming in. And if you could just keep your comments or questions brief, and your question, please.
Thank you, Simi, and it was great to watch the whole event today. And I want to say hello to Dhruva, whom I've missed for a while, but it's great to listen to you and to all the panelists. Now, I'll make my remarks a little brief, and I'll just make 3 points. One is, I think, from the sense I get from the conversation going so far, is that there is a non-clarity, or it's not clear whether Quad's functions in the future is going to be based on China's actions. I hope somebody, especially maybe somebody from Australia, can talk about this, but Dhruva also. I mean, my own sense is from March till now, we've seen tremendous progress in the way we've decided to work together, and there are many working groups, etc. I think that's an important point to be made, that look, this time Quad may have emerged because of China's behavior, or the Chinese the Chinese expert was also mentioning, Dr. Li, that China feels encircled, and I think there's been great amount of pains taken to say that this is not an Asian NATO, it is something else, and it's going to grow. So what would the panelists think about that? The second is, I see a very strong vein of skepticism coming from the European expert, who is wondering whether the American ability to lead would depend really on their domestic elections that can come about in 2024. I would like to say, and I hope maybe Mr. Daesh can talk about this. Our understanding is that there is a across the government understanding of the threat China poses, and this is not just administration-wise, kind of a description for their national security strategy. I think there is a clear understanding across the government, and there is a pan-American sentiment that says that we need to be clear about how to engage with China and how to also engage in a competition with China. So this conversation is very clear outside of partisan politics, is my understanding, but I hope to get more clarity on that. And the final point is, Dhruva, you mentioned trade and trade agreements. I can't agree with you more, but I want you to just, maybe this is just a teaser, Simi, but trade with China, India's trade with China has actually increased despite our very many differences that we've had because of certain reasons. I mean, I know some of them, but maybe Dhruva, you could also explain why trade is beyond a certain, initiation on geopolitics, cannot really control trade or shut off trade, or, it's not like a tap. I mean, there are many things involved in that. So trade agreements, on the other hand, are very different. So I can't agree with you more, but would you like to also say why India's trade with China? What do you think? Do you think it will come down, or do you think it's going to be stuck where it is? And how do we cope with that trade? What shall I say? It's like a pincer on us. So can you talk about that? Because I'm basing it on even the supply chain working groups, etc. We've come across many arguments which say that dependence on China is not so easily shaken. So China also has gone the extra mile in trying to get some investments, place investments in EU, for example, etc., etc. So there are many ways of looking at trade and investment. So what is your take? And I do hope the EU question also gets answered. Thank you, Simi.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your intervention. Very, very important. And thank you for joining in. So I would like to request Graeme Dobell to respond to Professor Vijayalakshmi's questions, if you would like to. And then I would invite Dr. Felix.
Yeah, I think the Quad question is I mean, I think part of the response on the Quad is that it isn't, as you say, it isn't just about China, although China has had a lot to do with making the Quad revive and resurrect. The resurrection of the Quad has much to do with China, but it is as much about what the Quad offers to ASEAN particularly, the ASEAN centrality language that you find in the Quad discussions is very much about saying to the ASEAN that you do have other options, that there are other ways to go forward, that China is not the beginning and the end of the discussion. There are other options. But I think the other point about the Quad is the set of internal dynamics that we're starting to see. We're starting to see it not just in terms of the diplomatic relationships that are operating across the board and across Asia. The Quad diplomacy now is part of the way an Australian diplomat or a Japanese diplomat or an Indian diplomat is going to be thinking about what they're doing. The Quad fell over the first time because, quite frankly, Australia wasn't prepared to put any bets on India or Japan. And I think India had some of the same sorts of doubts. Quad 2 happens because Australia now thinks that it's got to be prepared to put bets on India and bets on Japan. And the final thought about that, of course, is about what sort of anchorage effect the Quad can have on the United States. And you know as much as anyone on this panel that the US always has options. And one of the things that we've just gone through is we've had 4 years of the most revisionist president that we have ever seen in the United States, which was an interesting experience of a stress test for the US system, but also for the Indo-Pacific system. So the Quad is very much about the United States and that anchoring effect as much as it is about some of those other dynamics.
Thank you. Thank you, Graeme. Dr. Felix, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I to an extent, I have to say, disagree, because yes, there is I would say, yes, I agree there's a cross-party, bipartisan, essentially outlook on China, which perceives China first and foremost as a threat or as a systemic rival or whatever you want to call it. However, in my view, and I would also love to hear Jack on this, but the observable behavior of different US administrations, to me, is what matters. I agree, the rhetoric is almost identical between, say, Trump and Biden, but in terms of the observable behavior and in terms of foreign policy making, I mean, the understanding of alliances, the transactionalism or not of in terms of foreign policy making, the skepticism or not vis-a-vis multilateral institutions, all of this, I think it does matter who sits in the White House and who doesn't. At least from a European perspective, I mean, we have definitely learned the hard way, and we always took it for granted, and Trump taught us the hard way that it really does matter. So in terms of the rhetoric, yes, I agree, but my outlook on the observable behavior is very, very different to yours. So I think from a European perspective, this is almost like the Damocles sword hanging over our heads that come 2025, there'll be dare I say, a smart, not Trump, but a smart version of Trump in the White House, leading essentially not only to the death of American democracy, but also to a massive disruption of international politics, with the major repercussions definitely for Europe, probably even more so than for the Indo-Pacific. But from a European perspective, I think, and I just wanted to put this out for discussion here, I think the observable behavior is very, very different. Not so much the rhetoric, but the observable behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Felix. Jack, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think that's a sharp insight, Felix. There's a degree to which the consensus has sort of moved the Overton window, and Washington has moved to a much stronger rhetorical footprint on China. But still, when you look at the military posture in the region, when you look at the strategy, there's still a long way to go. And there's a division in this administration, it seems, between sort of the China hawks, just as there was under the Trump administration, who want sort of a tougher stance, a tougher rhetoric on China, more military in the region, versus people who are more consensus-based. I mean, the institutional perspectives of the State Department and the Treasury Department and the trade representative in the US have all tended to be just more institutionally in favor of a consensus-based trading relationship, as opposed to sort of a more aggressive finger-wagging relationship that we saw under Trump. So I think there are those two elements of that. as well as the question, yeah, I mean, does the US sort of take a more unilateral tack on China going forward? You know, if there's another Republican administration, do they decide that the Quad and other multilateral or minilateral forums are less useful or a subset of the main thing, as opposed to sort of what we've seen under Biden as kind of the main item on the menu? So those are, I think, the unsettled questions on the US side, whether you go unilateral or multilateral, and just how aggressive on China, how much you turn the dial up.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Dr. Lee, would you like to respond to any of these questions? Dr. Lee?
I'm fine. It's okay. Yeah,
Sure,
it was
sure.
not a right
Yes.
question for me. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. And Dhruva, over to you. Most of the questions are very, very important. And what's your take on them, if you could?
I mean, I think some of them were answered by more capable people who know much more about the subjects than I do. I would just address the last one on sort of trade and the trade relation. I mean, I think it's important to note, while there was a bounce back because of constraints last year of the due to the pandemic, there was a bounce back in India-China trade. I think it was 45%, as I recall. It's actually less than the increase of in many of India's trade with other trade partners, including the US, Indonesia, Japan. It was much more significant, and that suggests, again, while there is a certain stickiness, a certain resilience to some of the trade, there is also perhaps a slow diversification underway. And again, it's hard to assess that based on 1 year's data, but I think we'll see over time. The most significant change, I think, is let me put it this way. I think existing supply chains are very hard to divert. It's very costly. There are often not really alternatives. So just to take the pharmaceutical industry as one example, India is one of the largest pharmaceutical exporters in the world, but is dependent on a lot of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China, which is the largest manufacturer of APIs. And even during the last 2 years of dispute, there has been this huge demand for pharmaceuticals around the world, including COVID-related drugs. And India has been, Indian manufacturers have been trying to supply that, and Chinese providers have continued to supply throughout all of that. So I think it's very hard, pre-existing, there are long-term investments in establishing some of these. It's very hard to divert them. And even if they were to happen, and if there was political direction to do that, it would take a decade at least, 5 to 10 years minimum for those supply chains to shift. That said, my sense is, there are some manufacturers who are already US-based manufacturers, Taiwanese manufacturers, Korean manufacturers to some degree, who are looking at markets outside of, manufacturing outside of mainland China. Some of it has to do for political reasons, but a lot of it has to do for other reasons, growing wages in China, growing regulatory uncertainty and other factors. And the fact is, countries like Vietnam, Mexico, in some degrees Philippines, India, are becoming more competitive and are able, have the necessary infrastructure, are part of in Vietnam's case, part of all the necessary trade agreements to be integrated. The most significant aspect, I think, has been looking at next generation economic and trade relations. So 5G telecom, digital companies, public procurement into systems. And in all those cases, you've seen restrictions that the Indian government has placed over the last year on Chinese corporations. And so companies like Huawei have been adversely affected by a de facto, something similar to what Japan and Australia have done, which is a sort of de facto security constraints on certain companies. And then, in the case of ByteDance, of TikTok, an outright ban. So you have seen Chinese companies affected, but many of it, much of that will hit future market potential rather than current. It'll take time before that is really reflected in terms of the sort of economic and trade relationship. So that's the long and short of it. There still is continuing advocacy on the part of the Indian private sector to maintain some of these relations, largely for cost-related reasons. But again, I think you're having that tension between national security imperatives sometimes and political imperatives versus sort of economic and trade imperatives. So the long and short of it is I don't see any country sort of anything happening in the next year or two that will be that dramatic, but we may see a trend line that will lean in a certain direction.
Thank you. Thank you, Dhruva, for those responses. And I'm so grateful that you were able to take those questions. So I would just quickly, because we are running out of time, I would like to invite you to discuss the way forward. Where are we going from here? What does a future specter of in the Indo-Pacific look like? So I would like to invite Jack first to go, and please share your views briefly.
Oh, I think I'm left with little to add after the discussion, but yeah, I do think just to piece together a little bit forward. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is still looking for consensus on the issue, both on a governmental side and sort of deeper into the country. You know, I think the American public, of course, has gotten more aggressive on China, particularly in the COVID era and sort of the rhetoric that came out of the Trump administration. But I think the bigger question is, particularly on the military side, which I spend a lot of time thinking about and covering, the American public hasn't lost, you know, a lot of lives or a lot of troops or, you know, something that you would see in a conflict with China. So I think the question that the American people have to ask are sort of, are they ready to steel down for, you know, something that could be decades long or something that could also be quite lethal in a matter of minutes? So it's just, you know, really a question of political will. And certainly that's what people seem to be thinking about. That's what the Pentagon's guess about folks in Beijing, that they're thinking about how to test America's political will when it comes to institutions like the Quad and when it comes to the military.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jack. Dr. Felix, your views?
Yeah, thank you so much. Just 2 points more comments or points for future discussion really than a summary. I'll leave that to more qualified colleagues here. The one of the points didn't really talk about, which might have a major impact if we talk about the Indo-Pacific in actually the midterm rather than the short term, is the issue of climate change. I think briefly addressed by Dhruva with regards to the Nicobar Islands, I think it was, but I think generally for the region and the confluence of the 2 seas, an increasingly important challenge that I think would warrant a specific seminar, I think, rather than talk about it briefly in passing here. But I just wanted to mention it on the sidelines of this event. I think the security implications, but also the economic implications for human security, especially for food security and so on and so forth, I think we all need to take much more serious in the future. That would be my one point. The other point I wanted to make is on the issue of diversification and actually deglobalization in a way, which also might shape the Indo-Pacific in the midterm much more increasingly in terms that it might end up actually less integrated than more integrated, less connected than more connected region in the midterm, through effects of deglobalization and diversification, that we end up with a world of a multipolar kind of sub-regional sort of spheres of influence rather than the one in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Felix. Dr. Li, would you like to share your views, your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Well, certainly, China will continue to keep a close watch of the developments, the evolution of the Indo-Pacific. I think people in the policy community are probably saying that this is not a nightmare yet. It's not doomsday for China. I look at Japan's strategic outlook, Japan's policy with China. There's a lot of competition, a lot of strategic distrust, but at the same time, there's quite a bit of political willingness in Japan to cooperate with China, work with China. And India, I think many Chinese people may have been surprised that India has walked so far in terms of embracing the Indo-Pacific and realigning with the United States. But I think there's still a bit of hope in Beijing that India will continue to stick to its major power, diplomacy, foreign policy, and try to maintain a certain level of autonomy. And certainly Beijing will continue to hope that ASEAN countries, or at least most ASEAN countries, will continue to be neutral, will not take side. We already know that in the Chinese policy circle, broadly speaking, if you include analysts and research institutes, they are already asking some of the self-reflection questions. They have, by and large, now understood that some of the things or negative things, I should say, that have happened in the Pacific region towards China or against China are results of China's own policies and security behaviors. So it's the beginning. People are asking these questions, but whether we're going to see some dramatic policy revamp, whether Beijing is going to return to some sort of like a charm offensive we've seen in the 2000s, it's a big question, and you will need time, and you will probably need to see what Chinese leaders present at the 20th Party Congress in winter next year. So yeah, hopefully this round of policy review and all the self-reflection questions and internal discussions may be presented at the next Party Congress next year. And then, there is a possibility that in 2 years' time, or starting from 2022, you're going to see probably some major differences in China's regional security policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Li. I would like to now invite Dhruva to share his concluding views, the way forward.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have too much to add. Obviously, this is going to be a topic that will be debated and deliberated and argued about for many years to come. But I do think it's interesting to get sort of multiple viewpoints and obviously differences. But I'm not sure. I do think it's something that also, particularly in this forums like this, will be very important, particularly to raise consciousness amongst people in India and elsewhere about some of the dynamics at play, because ultimately, it's nice to we talk about high politics sometimes in very vague terms and sort of like the pieces of chess pieces on a board in very abstract terms, but it is often important to remember that these have implications for people. It'll affect in future possibly where people study, what people study, if you're a student, opportunities that will be available or not available to you. If you're a small business owner, where you'll likely be cooperating with, where you'll be investing, where you'll be where you're doing your manufacturing. So many different ways I think this will affect sort of the day-to-day lives of many people in the region. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. So I'll just end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruva. And Graeme Dobell, over to you. Your thoughts, your concluding thoughts.
Been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. Been reminded of much. I think that that where Dhruva started with this idea of new reality is very important. It is new reality. So much has changed. Thinking that really, say, in the first decade of this century, the words were about engagement. The words were about hedging, quiet hedging. Well, the hedge has got a little bit prickly. And in terms of that, the hedging discussion, I think we've moved beyond hedging. We're not hedging anymore. So we've gone more to discussion of words like balancing and competition and pushback, and how that works with engagement and cooperation. And I think Chinese strategists, I think Dr. Li's right, Chinese strategists are looking at what they've won and what they've lost over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and working out how much they've got from their behaviour, how many wins they've got. And I think that one of the things that's interesting is that while China might not use the phrase Indo-Pacific, it is very conscious that this new system, this new central balance is coming into place for a range of reasons. And China has got to work out what its role is going to be in this central balance, as much as India does. And that's one of the fascinating points about it, is that India was able, in an earlier era, to be non-aligned. India was able to have its independence in many ways. Well, in this new reality, India has got to be all in, because the system is so much about India as much as it is about China. And now that really is new reality.
Wow, amazing. So the new reality, here we are all in. So thank you so much. It has been so fascinating and thought-provoking discussion today. And I would like to formally propose the vote of thanks and thank all of you for your amazing, enriching insights and proactive participation, and also for sharing your views on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, I totally agree that this actually calls for continued deliberations and discussions, as Dr. Felix just mentioned. And we really look forward to further engagements with you and learning and exploring more opportunities and more nuances of the whole concept of Indo-Pacific and how the competition is emerging. I thank our speaker for the day, Dhruva Jaishankar, Graeme Dobell, Dr. Li Mingjiang, Jagdesh, and also Dr. Felix for your proactive participation. I would also like to thank Professor K.P. Vijayalakshmi for joining in, and also to all the participants here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. And there were several representatives of different embassies of different countries here in India. So I thank you all for joining in, and also to all those who would be watching us later on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and listening to us on our podcasts. So thank you so much. I am really grateful on behalf of Team IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies. Thank you and have a good day, good evening, and everyone, please stay safe. Thank you.